Hello, I'm Craig Constantine.
I'm Simon Christopher Pellett of Music on Your Own Terms.
Terrific. Thank you for introducing yourself. It makes my job so much easier.
Mhm.
I got two questions. Let's do the easy one
Sure.
first. A lot of people mention their middle name, and you and I were talking about that a bit. And give me the backstory about why is Christopher so key?
Um, I mean, I like the name. One of my, we named our middle child Christopher. But um, you ever Google your name and find out who else has the same name?
Yes, I'm apparently
So
famous in TV circles too.
yeah, so I did that not too long ago, and I found out that this guy in the south of England, where I'm from, was a customs and excise officer at the port of Dover, and
Hmm.
he got put away for 27 years or something for gun running and drug smuggling. And so he's effectively trashing my SEO. But the funnier part of that is that when I was first getting into the internet in the what mid 90s, late 90s, and did the same exact thing, I actually emailed him because he was still a school kid. And I found his email address and said, "Hey, we have the same name and we only live like, an hour away from each other." Ha ha ha. And never thought about it again until, yeah, maybe
They
3 or
saw the
4 months
news.
ago.
and,
So
and
if you Google me, make sure you put my middle name because
Christopher, I'm going to say
otherwise,
Simon, not that one.
not
Pellet
that
would
one.
not
Yep.
be. That doesn't roll off the same way the tongue, the same way that
Right.
Christopher does. So you mentioned being on the internet from the early days,
Hmm.
and we do a little pre-conversation first. And one of the first things you said when I asked you about podcasting was, "It's the new radio."
Hmm.
And we also talked about you have an extensive music background in New England, and I'm going to say your passion seems to be, I want to say, browbeating musicians into using podcasting to to
It
get
can
it
feel
done.
like that, sure.
Was there a point where having been a podcast consumer from
Mhm.
basically from the beginning, right? Was there a point where you realized that you could do something different with the podcasting medium from the musician's point of view?
Yeah, for sure. I was listening to people like Pat Flynn and Tim Ferriss's earlier work and all that kind of stuff. So I was consuming this. Um, I was consuming all this entrepreneurial stuff and self help. Well, not self help, but self improvement
Self
business.
improvement, right?
And yeah, just the pushback I was getting when I was playing live, suggesting things to the bands was in, meeting people that were doing the same things. They were saying the same negative. You can't make money because of streaming. It's killing the industry. And I'm like, all these other things for entrepreneurship I've been hearing is basically spinning, the conversation on its head. So how can I make money rather than like find the ways that you can get from A to
Hmm.
B, and it's reframing things in your mind, like you know like American Idol and things like that kind of teach the general populace that all you need is one big break and you've made millions. And behind the scenes, it's like it takes 10 years to be an overnight success. There's a lot of work
Right.
that goes into it,
Right.
and that's true of any type of business or anything you do. And I just knowing all this entrepreneurial stuff and gaining more and more knowledge, I just wanted to put it into a format where um I just wanted to get people more clued in on that nature. And also, I need to mention that it all stemmed out of a big depression I was going through, and my high school friend turned me onto all this and turned me into a podcast junkie. From Tony Robbins down, all these great authors and content producers, and so part of my podcast is mental health
Mm.
because that's also a topic that I feel it's really important to get out there and talk about because it breaks down stigma. It makes people feel that they're less alone. Somebody else is going through it. So I like to put all that stuff into a box where I interview musicians most of the time, and we talk about this stuff.
Hmm. Are there things that musicians are surprised by? Like to me, going into podcasting just seems like such an easy transition. Like, oh, you don't have
Mhm.
to deal with so many middlemen. Oh, like
Right.
creative control is already a challenge, and it's like, well, now you have creative control. Like, are there things that the average musician that you talk with that they're surprised by?
In terms of the business aspect or the podcast
Yeah, like
itself?
in terms of like, oh, I can do what? Like, when they see what they can do through podcasting.
Um, I mean, it depends who you ask. If I think people know that there's no barrier to the music industry anymore, and podcasting is the same thing. I think it's just one of those things where you have to keep telling people over and over until it gets in there.
Hmm.
It's true of anything. Like the marketing, like the seven contact points of marketing, I think it's called, was around in the 30s. Somebody has to see your ad seven times before they actually buy something, and I think that's true of us as human beings. We just need to see the same information, and maybe that's why I became such a podcast junkie in the first place. Is because kind of knew most of the information, or I knew some of it, but then you listen to one person say it, and then you listen to another person reframe it, and then you kind of get the concept. And between all these different outlets, they're all saying pretty much the same thing, but they're just rephrasing it differently. And I think once you hit that one person that says that one thing in just the right way, it all that information flows through, and I got it now. Just
Hmm.
you may have heard it like five times, but it's
Yeah, if you had started with
it's
that
getting
last
in
one,
there.
it would have still taken the other four, the
Yeah,
other five, the other six.
for sure.
So do you, when you have an artist on your show, what are the kinds of things that you're interested in like digging out of them? Like, what are the kinds of the threads of thought that interest you to investigate when you're talking to a musician?
So I like to get a background of why they got into music, and then why they got into their respective instruments. I like finding out that early spark of interest. If they're a teacher, then I like to talk about why or how they frame their teaching, and what their mindsets are of learning and transferring that knowledge to their students. Um, Musicians that are specifically entrepreneurial, like um, I'll name drop Martin Atkins, who was a drummer for Public Image Limited, Johnny Rotten's band after the Sex Pistols,
Hmm.
Ministry, all the way through to being a professor now at a Chicago university, and still very active in the punk scene. Um, I wanted to draw out of him, like, where was the spark of entrepreneurship way back when you were like going into these bands that had no t-shirt sales. They're trying to move into bigger offices, but they've got no income. Like, oh, all right, we need to sell this stack of records to this distributor. Oh, there's £1,000.
Hmm.
What made him think of that when the other band members and the manager didn't think like that?
Hmm.
That's the
Well,
kind of thing. Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, how do bands like, I hadn't really thought about a band as an entrepreneurial like uh gang or an
Right.
entrepreneurial cohort or team. Um, do you find, like, has it been your experience talking to these people that the ones that we see from the outside, like if we see somebody who's successful, do you find that there was something magical about the team that they assembled? And what I'm wondering is it possible for, like, let's say I make a band with four people. If I have one person on the team who just doesn't have that entrepreneurial bug, can the three of us like convert that person, or is it going to
Mhm.
be an eternal struggle with that for, like, is there something about, so you were describing that particular person seeming to have an eye for it, but the
Yeah.
people that don't have an eye for it, and have bands managed to convert that person?
Good question. I mean, that might reframe some of my questioning, to be honest. But I think, from my experience going back to my band, I had that pushback, and there was like one person in the band that just wanted to do this one instrument and maybe write. There's one person that did the booking. There was one person that did this. Um, I think it's dependent on the situation. I don't think there's any magic to anything. I think you need a team, like, especially today. I mean, I think even in the days of record companies, there was always a team. It just happened to be in a big building with tons of money behind it.
Hmm.
pushing the music out. But as an independent artist, you have to have a team. You can do everything yourself, but it's like three full-time jobs at the same time.
Recipe for
So
burnout, right?
yeah, well, exactly. So you can only do so much. So you just have to start delegating. And if you have a group of four people in the band and one person has no, maybe you can start delegating them tasks if they're okay with it. But if they're a really, really good bass player, let's say, and they write really great riffs, maybe you should just be okay with that. It depends on your level. I think I've had this conversation with somebody, and I'm trying to figure out who it was, but yeah, it's a case of if if you're okay with that person just doing the music portion and being good at their instrument, great. If they can do graphics, great. If they can, be a bit more, if they can just move stuff from A to B, then that's great too. But it all depends on your level of comfort in the beginning, and I think that's something you just have to have a conversation up front, saying what are you willing to do, what can you do, and then what are we expecting. So
Hmm.
if those three things don't really line up, then you end up in arguments and people leave and get frustrated. But if you can come to an agreement of what's expected or what people have the ability to do, it's not even a question of I want to do something, I just don't have the ability to do that thing. Whether it's you know
Hmm.
endless examples like marketing or finance, but if no one in that band can do that one thing, you may have to hire a lawyer. You should hire a lawyer
Right.
regardless, but um,
In that
you
particular
have to
case.
find someone to do your books. You have to find, maybe booking is not a strong point for everyone, so then you have your first port of call, maybe a booking agent.
Hmm.
There's people that do those things. It's just a case of can we afford it, and who can do it instead of hiring it out.
Hmm. I've read a bunch of different things from different sources about, it's often called just the gatekeeper.
Hmm.
And the idea is, when space was limited, whether that's billboard space, advertising space on TV, a number of concert venues, when something is limited, then somebody gets to choose.
Right.
And then with that choosing comes power. And it kind of can cut both ways. So if it's, I'm trying to think of like a platform agnostic example, but if the person who's doing the choosing, they're going to have a certain style, and
Right.
if the consumers love that style, great, I can just follow what you do. But that it seems to me that historically, thinking about music, thinking about radio, thinking about record sales, historically that gatekeeper power has been vastly asymmetrical, and it works really good for the big labels. So okay, that's all kind of like, people should understand that that's the norm, that the internet fixed that or broke it,
Hmm.
whichever side of the wall you were on. But what I'm thinking is, how can musicians use podcasting as like a force multiplier to
Hmm.
like get further, or to get more, to accomplish more of their dream, not necessarily to reach more people, but like how can they use it to get things done that they want to get done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've been kind of thinking about different forms of marketing and for bands. Yeah, I mean, I think reaching more people is always going to be the ultimate goal, because you just need to get your stuff out there. Right now, the gatekeeper is that noise level where there's so many thousands and thousands of people
Right.
putting stuff, putting their music on the internet every single day. Like there's no, well, I mean, there's room. There'll be exponential room, but server lands in California or whatever. But it, I think the way that musicians can use podcasting to their advantage is by talking about other subjects other than trying to sell their music. So one idea I've been coming up with is trying to figure out, all right, what other than music, what other what are your other hobbies? Let's say you're into cooking or you're into sports. Start tweeting about the sports team or start thinking about recipes. So now you can go on to guest on a show that's about cooking, share your recipe with the audience and talk about cooking. Oh, by the way, I'm in a band. Like that's how you're introduced. I'm the singer of said
Hmm.
band.
Right.
And, it builds connection with your audience, because now, you might have 10 people that listen to that type of music, who listen to that podcast because of the food aspect,
Yeah, you're
and
doing the Venn diagram, right?
they find out about your band because of that podcast, where they wouldn't necessarily have done it because you're in two parts of the country, and that just gives you that kind of conduit to be able to get your music out to people further. I mean,
Mm.
outside of that, yeah, I mean, it's a case of you can use podcasts. You could start your own podcast, just talking about something different, and people may end up. Actually, that's a very good point, because um, Simon Tam, I saw at CD Baby 2019. He's a member of a band called The Slants. They're an Asian American band, kind of pop rock. They started doing anime conventions, and one of his marketing, he's a brilliant marketing like genius. They went on tour and they started visiting restaurants because they're foodies. So they started a Yelp account, had all the band information on the Yelp account, and then started reviewing all these restaurants, and even went so far as to like pick their top 10 restaurants of that tour and have a placard in the windows. And then
Mm.
people were actually seeing the reviews, seeing the placards, and finding out about their bands, and they got downloads specifically just through the Yelp
I'm
reviews.
looking for a burger on Tuesday in Michigan,
Yeah.
and I
Oh
find a
wow.
band, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
So, I
that's
mean,
an
you could do the same thing with podcasting.
yeah, and I think it speaks to the idea that not I mean, not everybody, but most people would want more connection to their favorite bands. Like pick your
Mhm.
favorite band. How many albums did they do? Like how many concerts can there possibly be? If you really love the band, you really can only get so much of their music. And it is neat to see, oh, these guys like this food, or
Right.
here they are talking about this topic, or,
Mhm.
there are a bunch of bands I can think of through history. I'm like, could somebody please do an hour long podcast of where the song comes from? Just, what's the actual backstory, how to get written, tell us the stories of how things got recorded. There's so much that I would believe happens when the artists are getting together to record, and like, what are those experiences like? And that stuff you could share in a number of mediums, but podcasting screams out as a great way to do that.
Absolutely. Are you familiar with this the Song Exploder podcast?
Nope, not that one.
That one is specifically that, exploring an album an artist's
Mm,
like work, and they go in and they dissect stuff. So you might get a kick out of that one.
that's neat. Do you find that uh, so the people that are listening to your show, and like as a podcaster, right,
Mhm.
feedback from anybody is like you don't get a lot, but have you gotten any surprising feedback from listeners of your show, things that you really weren't expecting when you started the project?
Um, I wouldn't say I didn't get, I haven't really gotten any surprising feedback. Um, the biggest surprise was, just from an episode interviewing my guitar teacher from when I was like 13 through 16. I don't want to say how many decades ago it was, but I went back. I said, "Hey, I follow him on Instagram, and I said, you want to come on the podcast and have a chat?" And he's like, "Sure." So we had this conversation, and I realized afterwards when I was editing it, like all the there was so much subconscious information that he'd passed for those 3 years that he taught me, that I didn't even, you know, that there was lessons that I've passed on to my own students, but the subconscious life lessons that I got
Mm,
from him was just like, whoa! I didn't realize he taught me that just by talking to him. So that was the biggest surprise, and I don't think we have a lot of time left. I wanted to go down a tangent, but we
it's
will have to
okay.
do a part two. Well, I was just going to say that the biggest surprise was my realization of why I started the podcast in the first place. I say it's because of entrepreneurship and music, but I really think because of my anxiety and my depression, I think my subconscious is basically telling me you need to start doing something where you can actually talk rather than I was very good at writing and phrasing in written word and going back and editing emails, but
Mm.
You stick me in front of a microphone and I freeze up, and I had some severe stage anxiety, which caused like some spasming in my neck and stuff. It was horrible. Um, and have a conversation and talk intelligently without stuttering was pretty bad at one point. So I think my subconscious was basically saying, do this thing because it's going to make you better at talking to people, and you'll actually, maybe make some friends, which, I've made some really great friends and connections with podcasting. So,
Yeah, the
that is
connections
just
are
like the
amazing.
biggest thing for me.
Cool. Well, Simon Christopher Pellett, I think
I
that's probably a good place to call it for today.
think so.
I was, when you said connections, I was thinking like, yeah, there's a train of connections that led me, but I'm not going to unpack it. People can ask me if they see me in person. So it was a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you, to meet you, to talk about podcasting from a musician's perspective. That's definitely something I had never really thought about from that point of view before. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was really fun.